welcome to G News, the good news.
Yeah, right.
Hi everyone, it's great to see you again for another G News podcast. Tonight we're going to be talking about building a more values-based Aotearoa New Zealand, which will be better for all of us. Joining me tonight to talk more about the journey so far and where we could go is Rhodes Scholar, barrister, campaign manager and author Max Harris. Hi Max, welcome to the show.
Kia ora, Jared. Yeah, nice to be here, and thanks for all the work you've done with G News. It's been great.
Oh, that's cool, man. Hey, look, you've met some very interesting people along the way. You've worked with Dame Sian Elias, the former Supreme Court Chief Justice. You've worked with Helen Clark in the UN in New York. You've witnessed some major political campaigns with the Labour Party in the UK. And you've been a campaign manager for Efeso Collins. You've been interacting with people like Moana Jackson and Annette Sykes. And you've been a champion for progressive ideas and for value-based politics and political change through action. But over the last several years, we've seen quite a major backlash from the right wing that's frustrated the realization of a lot of these initiatives and concepts. So isn't now the time, if there is a time, really for much of what you've been proposing and promoting to actually become more New Zealand's normal reality?
Yeah, that's a great question, and yeah, I have been really lucky to work closely with some really inspiring people. Yeah, who I've learned a lot from. In terms of the current time, at times it can seem pretty bleak, right? We've got a world hurtling towards global boiling. We've got rampant inequality and a billionaire class with more political influence than ever. A far right and a right politically that has taken hold in lots of countries. But as you said, I think what this shows is the need for collective action and collective values-based action in order to arrest some of these really worrying trends, in order to tackle some of these challenges. And I think as we move further and further into this kind of what some have called a kind of like poly crisis, I think people are going to be looking for progressive, positive solutions. So yeah, I do think now is also the time to be talking about those reasons for hope.
Yeah, well, your book, The New Zealand Project, that was written during a John Key government at a very specific time, and it presented values-based politics as a way forward. Specifically, the values of care, the values of community, and the value of creativity. What is behind the importance of these values for New Zealand?
Yeah, that book came out of doing a series of interviews with people who I looked up to and who I felt were kind of progressive champions, to use the word you used earlier. And what I was looking for was a way to kind of refresh our progressive approach. So I wanted to find some new language to carry progressive ideas. And my feeling, first of all, was that values are a really powerful way to communicate and carry progressive solutions. And that's because in New Zealand, there's a long history of Māori values-based thinking, where Māori have talked about collective values like manaakitanga and aroha. But also there's another strain of values-based thinking from other communities and cultures in New Zealand. So I thought that there was a kind of sweet spot in seeing values as a way forward. And then, these three values, care, community, and creativity, came out of thinking about what seemed to be needed at that particular moment in the mid-2010s, where we'd had, we were moving into a third term of a John Key government. We'd had state housing sold off, we'd had asset sales. We had what I felt was an increasingly individualistic, atomized, lonely society. And in my view, these were values that could point to a different way forward. And I also talked about love and the politics of love as a kind of extension of some of these values.
That's great. You were talking about Maori values, and just made me think about constitutional transformation. We hear about constitutional transformation, and we hear about 2040 being a target. And we also hear quite a bit about Mai Tiki Mai, which was born out of a iwi working group led by Moana Jackson and Margaret Mutu, who did an extensive consultation with 252 hui and more. And I had heard that the important thing there was really getting the values right, and that the values, they took a long time to actually make sure they got those exactly right. Could you talk a little bit about Matiki Mai values and perhaps the models that came out of that consultation for a new constitution, and really how they may relate to te tiriti or whakaputanga?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think this was like a really amazing process around Matiki Mai. And if anyone hasn't heard of that, really encourage you to look it up. The report is online. And yeah, as you said, it came out of these discussions with Māori where Moana Jackson, Margaret Mutu, others, Veronica Tawhai, asked the question, how do we want to be governed? And yeah, what are the rules that should be in place for how power is exercised? And yeah, there were a lot of young rangatahi meetings as well that were a key part of that Moana in particular always used to speak about. And so yeah, a series of values came out of there, as you mentioned. So values like belonging. So the idea that this was kind of key to being in Aotearoa was having a place that we call home. And Moana also wrote beautifully about, for example, in an E Tangata piece, Moana Jackson, about how Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the treaty, allows non-Māori to make a home here. So belonging was key. There were other values like structure, which is an interesting one for thinking about how we should be governed. And to get onto the second part of your question about the models, at the end of that document, the authors and the people involved with that process wanted to nod towards what a different constitution would look like. And they wanted to be, I think, imaginative and not just, design a political system that copy and pastes some Westminster model from halfway around the world. And what they came up with, as you said, were these new models, and all of them referred to different spheres of authority. And in particular, they came back to three spheres: a kāwanatanga sphere, so like a government sphere; a tino rangatiratanga sphere, so a sphere where Māori tino rangatiratanga, guaranteed by Article 2 of Te Tiriti, is operative; and then a relational sphere where those spheres interact. And really, this is not highly unorthodox or unusual. We think about different spheres of authority already in the way our society operates. We have local government, we have central government, we have courts, we have bodies that operate with different kinds of authority. And yeah, what Moana and Margaret, Veronica and many others were trying to do was to say, yeah, what would this look like as a unique constitution for New Zealand? And as you say, it was also flowing from He Whakaputanga, the Declaration of Independence, which came before Te Tiriti o Waitangi, but is crucial to understanding the context of Te Tiriti. So yeah, I would really encourage people to go out and have a look at this document. You don't have to be a lawyer or a constitutional expert. It's really about values and power and how we want to live together in society.
There was a big backlash whipped up by the Atlas Network think tank, the Taxpayers Union, and Hobson's Pledge about he puapua. And could you talk about some of the defensive and threat-based reactions to constitutional transformation that we have actually seen from the political right in New Zealand? So
he puapua, for those who, people might have heard of that those words being thrown around. But just to give a bit more detail to that, because it often didn't get explained beyond the headlines. Really, what that document was suggesting some ideas for what an Aotearoa would look like if tino rangatiratanga were properly restored. And so it was thinking in different areas where policy is central, for example, in justice, what might it look like to have Māori authority over justice? And really this was building on ideas that had been developed earlier, including by Moana Jackson. You're absolutely right that there was this whipped up hysteria in the media that many people will remember, with an interlocking network of think tanks doing a lot of work to try to scaremonger about this. And to connect up Matike Mai and He Puapua, I think it's no coincidence that that scaremongering happened just when it did several years ago, because I think people were beginning to talk more about Matike Mai. People were getting to talk more about tino rangatiratanga and getting back to the original promise of Te Tiriti. And yes, suddenly there was this suggestion that Māori were wanting to take power by stealth, and that, it's important to remember, is like a running theme in New Zealand history, where in particular people on the right have tended at different points in time to say that somehow there's this power grab by Māori. So this was said during the Waikato War, just before the Waikato War in the 1860s. This was said by Don Brash in Orewa. This was said by Judith Collins during COVID, and this was said during He Puapua's release. And really, I think we should understand that as being is not reflective of most of New Zealand, who I think want to understand Te Tiriti, want to own our history. I think it was a small minority who felt very threatened by a potential new way of thinking about power, who felt perhaps their own power and wealth threatened. And so in order to kind of push back at this, wanted to create a sense of fear that wasn't justified. And I think it was actually that kind of led to a lot of very toxic and poisonous rhetoric about Te Tiriti, which has been circulating in recent years.
Yeah. So how would you sum up the way that Te Tiriti and its parent Whakaputanga acts as a roadblock, really, to neoliberal capitalism?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think one of the reasons that there has been so much scaremongering about Te Tiriti and He Whakaputanga, the Declaration of Independence, is that they could actually prevent some of the worst excesses of neoliberal capitalism, as you said. And let me explain how. So the first explanation is a kind of legal one, if you'll bear with me, and I'll try not to be too legalistic on this, but it's just a simple point that in the 80s and also in the 2000s, in a series of court cases, the principles of Te Tiriti o Waitangi were used to put a brake on some very hurried privatizations. So the privatization of state-owned enterprises in the 80s, and then again, the mixed ownership model that the John Keeley government tried to bring in the 2000s and in 2010s. And so one way in which Te Tiriti was a roadblock was as a legal brake. And so you can see that those people wanting privatization will also want to take away that roadblock and take away Te Tiriti. A second way it acts as a roadblock on privatization is Te Tiriti is about power sharing. So the original promise was signed up to, and that many continue to affirm, not just Māori, but in particular Māori over the years, was about tino rangatiratanga for Māori, paramount, chiefly authority for Māori, kāwanatanga for the Crown, government for the Crown, and Māori having the same rights as British subjects. Those are the simple 3 articles of Te Tiriti. And when you have that power sharing arrangement, you can see that also interrupts the kind of ideal of being able to rush through privatization with one single all-powerful government. And so that's the second way it can be a roadblock. I can say more about that, but hopefully that gives listeners some idea of how Te gets in the way of privatisation, and it's another reason why it's really important that we uphold Te. We should uphold it because it's a founding document, but also because it has been a really important, effective protection against privatisation and extraction.
Great. Privatisation, to me, kind of falls under neoliberalism quite a lot, and what I'm seeing is there's a set of some quasi-constitutional laws that New Zealand's been working under for a few decades, and we basically kind of are confronting a little bit of a embedded neoliberalism situation. So I'm talking about laws like the Public Finance Act, the Reserve Bank Act, the Financial Responsibilities Act. What laws do you think that we need to look at or to potentially amend or repeal in order to undo this kind of embedded neoliberal straitjacket that we seem to be operating under?
Maybe I can just step back and say something about neoliberalism. Sorry, I realize I'm giving some long answers, and I'll try not to make this one so long, but just in case people don't kind of understand that term, really that's a term that captures what happened in New Zealand in the 80s and 90s in particular. And that was when we decided to sell off public assets. That's privatisation. So, for example, selling off the rail network, the trains. It was when there was deregulation, so loosening of the rules. It was when benefits were slashed in 1991, the Employment Contracts Act. Unions were smashed through the Employment Contracts Act, and benefits were slashed just around the same time in the early 90s by the national-led government. It's that policy package, but also a class project that was about building up the power of people who are already wealthy. And to come to your question, I do think we need to have a look at some of those laws that were passed then that really tied the hands of government, and they forced the government to act in a particular way, which put us down a path of low investment in social services, towards more selling off of assets, towards the kind of political and economic system that hangs over us now. So let me take a couple of concrete examples. The Public Finance Act talks about prudent debt, so it kind of locks government into low levels of government debt, which is very different, by the way, from private debt. But it's basically a lid that pushes down on what we can do to spend on health and education and housing and welfare. And that has held down our spending, which has also held down our ability to invest in our future. And so that's something that needs to change if we're needing to do responsible investment for our future. Another example, and then I'll stop because I'm getting into another long answer, but another example is that the Public Finance Act basically redesigned, and in conjunction with those other laws, it redesigned government to act like a series of companies. So rather than government being a single entity that works together across, say, health and education, it made departments act as siloed competitive entities that had to kind of bid for funding. And that really changed the promise of government and the ability of government institutions to work together. So that's something else that we need to rethink as we move beyond what is called neoliberalism, move beyond that Rogernomics, euthanasia era and towards a different model that is more communal.
Yeah, so this kind of big wrist wrestle that we've been talking about, kind of free ourselves. You've been recently involved in speaking out about a Hobson's Pledge advertisement that appeared in the New Zealand Herald, where they were talking about returning the ownership of the shoreline to the public, and a lot of things happened there. And more recently, the government were planning to change the law based on a Court of Appeal ruling, but they didn't take into account a process that was already in train with the Supreme Court. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that whole chapter?
Yeah, so in a way, this is like a concrete example of what we were talking about before, like how some people, like Hobson's Pledge, feel threatened by Te Tiriti and Māori rights, so try to whip up a sense of fear, but in order essentially to protect the interests of the wealthy, in my view. And so, yeah, what happened here was there was a ruling of the Court of Appeal about how essentially the revamped foreshore and seabed legislation, actually the national government had brought in, should be interpreted. And the Court of Appeal ruling simply made sense of the law and set out how certain marine and coastal rights could be established. And yeah, what Hobson's Pledge wanted to do, and this is a bit reminiscent of what Don Brash had done some 20 years earlier, was to say that suddenly our beaches are under threat. And this was dishonest and just inaccurate. And as you also said, they were trying to cut across an appeal process that was going through. And actually that decision ended up being tweaked by the Supreme Court. And they actually overturned part of the Court of Appeal decision. And so they weren't respecting the kind of usual separation of powers where the court's decisions are honoured. And I believe that law reform that the government was planning, so the government also ended up wanting to overturn the Court of Appeal decision, is on pause now after the Supreme Court decision, now that has fully played itself out.
We're seeing overall a government that I think is playing out a very anti-Maori agenda. We've seen recently the end of 7AA. We've seen the end of Section 27 reports that inform a judge about an offender's background. We've seen these attempts to change the Marine Area Coastal Act and the end of the Maori Health Authority. We've got coalition agreements that include, promises to review the scope of the Waitangi Tribunal, and we've got 28 mentions of the treaty principles that are going to be removed from our law. So I just wonder what you think is driving all of this big, anti-Maori big backlash. Does it all, possibly go back to a fear of a creative, ground-up constitutional transformation?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. So yeah, I think number one, it is fear that restoring Te Norangateratanga, properly upholding Te Tiriti, would threaten the power of especially the ACT Party's base, but also parts of the National and New Zealand First kind of voting base. I think this is also about Te Tiriti and Māori rights being a roadblock on privatisation, extraction, taking those out of the way to make privatisation easier. For example, privatisation of the healthcare system, which is being done in a quiet and very worrying way. I also think this is sort of pure politics. So the ACT Party in particular, but also National and New Zealand First, trying to take political oxygen and being willing to sacrifice the rights and interests of New Zealand's Indigenous people. I won't go on about this, but I do want to say that also if you're Pākehā, Tauiwi non-Māori, and you're listening, I think it's really important that we speak up about this. Internationally, New Zealand is known for, in some places, for having so-called good race relations or respecting Māori culture. And we can't claim that overseas and then allow this kind of thing to happen. But also, this is our founding document. It's the closest we have to, a kind of written constitution. And if we allow this founding document to be tampered with, then we open the door to other kinds of abuse of power. And I think we should all be proud of where we've come as a country, moving towards, singing the national anthem in English and Māori almost organically, like at rugby games, moving towards more te reo Māori being in everyday life and talking about whānau or kai and food, and that being normal and unique to this place. I think it's really special, and I think it means we can be a different kind of society from the UK, which is hardly any model for a society anyway. So yeah, I think it's really important we all express concern about this and continue to have conversations about it. And it was really heartening that 90% of people opposed the Treaty Principles Bill, as we found out last week.
It was, I keep thinking, well, as a barrister, it must be alarming to listen to some politicians lashing out at the judiciary, these threats to comity. And there's this kind of big underbelly on the right wing, and particularly on social media, that uses the term activist judges. And this not even just social media. I mean, some of these think tanks, they're using that kind of language. So what I'm seeing, when I tune into what they're doing, I see right-wing people going nuts about having to learn something like tikanga in order to get a qualification, and it's kind of like the end of their world. So what do you make of these kinds of right-wing attacks on the judiciary, because of this kind of change going on?
Well, I think they're kind of imported political tactics, in particular from the UK. So there's a think tank in the UK called Policy Exchange, which tried to whip up, it had a whole project called the Judicial Power Project, where they were trying to attack the UK judiciary. And I think it seems to be really just kind of removed from the UK and then implanted here. It gives me a lot of concern. There have been some fairly orthodox decisions, for example, the Smith and Fonterra decision about climate change, strikeout case I could talk more about, which, because some of those decisions threaten big commercial interests, have been really mischaracterized, including by groups like the New Zealand Initiative. And one way of thinking about it, and I've informed a little bit by a really excellent Ngāi Tahu academic, Matthew Scobie, is that this is just part of attacks on different ways the government is being held accountable. So if you think about, what's going to hold this government to account, it's partly the courts, because they make sure the government's following the law. So the government attacks the courts. It's partly universities, because academics can act as the critic and conscience of society and they're independent. So, the government attacks universities and they cut the funding to social sciences as they've done. And you also see this playing out across a range of other areas, like scientists, who can show the evidence that policy decisions are horrific for the environment. They've also been attacked and undermined. You see, this through the attacks on Māori. So I think that's one helpful lens through which to view this, is a targeting of those sites of accountability that would hold the government in line.
Yeah, I see that NZ initiative really playing a role here, and I see it's actually, I was looking through their website the other day and I saw they had a paper by Paul Goldsmith, and it was titled The Treaty of Waitangi, The Uses and Abuses of a Living Document, on their website. And it had chapters named A Lingering Sense of Grievance, The Emergence of the Treaty Industry, The Advancement of the Special Status Concept. And these points are like harboring resentment, and they're kind of like about driving wedges. Could you comment on the difference? What is justified grievance, and the reality of real compensation, and the notion of the special status that they say gives Maori greater say. And this kind of gets in the way of a lot of those people on the right wing, these kind of concepts that I just mentioned, I just sort of read out as chapter headings. Can you comment on that? Yeah,
for sure. First point to make is, I think Paul Goldsmith has a lot of power now. He's Minister of Justice. So he's overseeing a huge number of very important changes, not to mention his other responsibilities. And I think if you look back into some of the things he wrote, and there's some very worrying defences there of colonisation, and people should have a look at that paper that he wrote, which I also remember having a look at. So that's the first point. To come to your question, so justified grievance, how should we think about this? One way of putting this into perspective is remembering that Māori faced 160 years, sometimes longer, of displacement, confiscation of land, removal, individualization of title, attempts to destroy culture, so that the land held by Māori went from, being all of Aotearoa to a tiny, tiny fraction. And there was huge cultural loss, including loss of language. Not to say, of course, that Māori didn't remain active agents of resistance and fought and maintained political strength. But the key point here is the loss was huge, and yet the total sum of compensation under Treaty of Waitangi settlements several years ago was just over $2 billion. And I think around that time it was about the same amount as the annual corrections budget. So 1 year of what we spend on prisons was equivalent to the total amount of compensation given for that huge displacement, loss, confiscation, cultural destruction. So I don't think when we put that into perspective, we should be seeing that as grievance. That's a justified claim for a tiny fraction. And I agree with people that say, and I think Julia Whaipoti's made this point, that there's actually huge generosity from Māori. And Māori have been very magnanimous to say, we're going to take this small token of compensation and we're going to get on with trying to work together to build the society despite this historical injustice. Your question had lots of parts, but I guess another part was, are Māori getting a special say? And to me, if we're more comfortable with what Te Tiriti says, and we're more comfortable with Tino Rangatiratanga as being part of what was promised, we would stop saying things like, "Oh, this is a special say," and this is just what was promised, and we should stick to our promises. Not sure if I answered the last bit of your question, but hopefully that covers most of it.
That's really good. Recently, we've just concluded 80 hours of oral submissions to the Justice Select Committee on the Treaty Principles Bill, which got after 330,000 submissions that swamped the system. And we saw a huge number of experts submitting on the bill, and they were totally against the bill in a massive response. You've been actively fighting this bill for a long time. We're seeing it sort of going to be shot down very soon. So what's your take on the whole topic now?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, I think it was an incredible waste of time when people wanted to be getting on with their lives, in particular Māori, and in a profound error of judgment from the National Party to put that into a coalition agreement, basically to get into power. And Prime Minister Luxon has accepted that. And I think it really risked miseducating people about what is in Te Tiriti, because David Seymour went around saying, Te Tiriti means, first he said property rights for everyone, and then he said chieftainship for all New Zealanders. And, you can realise how absurd that is almost as soon as you say it. But, at a time when I think a lot of people want to know more about Te Tiriti, that really set everyone back. And I guess what I'm proud of is how Māori in particular led the pushback against this and brought a whole lot of people along a journey of Te Tiriti education. Also brought a whole lot of people into making submissions to a select committee for the first time. I've talked to quite a few people, right, in the last few months who have been learning, what a select committee is and what a submission is and how to write a good submission. And so I really admire how that poison of a bill, that profound error of judgment, has been turned into a moment of hope and a moment of teachable education. And there are lots of people to kind of credit for that, but Cassie Hartendorp, who's actually my boss at Action Station, has led the amazing Together for Te Tiriti campaign with Rangi Maria at Action Station and others as well. But some people have seen those posters around. And I think that's how we should be thinking about it now, as yes, a horrific error, the worst bill at least for 20 years, but something that was turned to good, in particular by Māori. And now we have to turn our attention to some other things. In particular, there's a review of the Waitangi Tribunal that I think is underway, Regulatory Standards Bill that I know you've been speaking about, and a number of other things. And so, now I think we have to get on to mobilising, and also mobilising for economic justice.
Well, just speaking of mobilising, and that kind of thing. Jane Kelsey recently gave a talk about how we need to shift our mindsets away from just winning elections and once you get into power and just playing to the centre, really, and adopt a more bold and more radical strategy, mirroring something like Roger Douglas's tactics. And I'll just read out what 3 of those points are. One is a kind of a blitzkrieg dismantling of right-wing laws. Number 2 is a scorched earth destruction of right-wing frameworks within the political system, which make it really hard to come back to, say, neoliberalism. 3, kamikaze politics, where you get the job done, but popularity doesn't matter. You just get it done. And this is about embedding mechanisms for left-wing ideas, sort of stacking the decks and anticipating what the attack strategy from the right would be in the future when they do return to power. So what do you think about that kind of approach to the next left-wing term of government?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of merit in what Jane Kelsey said there. So Jane, who taught me, is an amazing New Zealand thinker who I think we should be really proud of. Wrote books like The New Zealand Experiment, about that 1980s, 90s period, if you want to learn more about it, or The FIRE economy, FIRE standing for finance, insurance, and real estate, basically about how our economy is entirely geared towards those things. Obviously building on that work, I think what she said makes some sense. And let me just put it in my own words, or put it a slightly different way. She's speaking to progressive political parties, right? So like Labour, Greens, and Te Pāti Māori. And what she's saying is, if the right comes in and destroys the existing order, but also locks in a kind of right-wing way of doing things, and then if the progressive or left-wing political parties come in and say, oh, we're actually going to be quite slow and pushing back, and we're going to keep some of that right-wing agenda, then you still have an overwhelmingly right-wing architecture and a right-wing climate. And what I mean when I say right-wing here, I mean a really individualized, property-centered, profit-focused agenda that pushes us apart rather than bringing us together in community. So I think it's true that the next progressive government needs to be really clear about what its priorities are and needs sometimes to move really quickly. So for example, and let me be really constructive here, like I think we need new employment relations law. That's the law that governs rights at work. We essentially still have a slightly improved version of the Employment Contracts Act, and that's now almost 25 years old. I think 25 years old this year. We have sentencing law, which is out of date in my view and warped in its priorities. We have all of that economic law that we were both talking about earlier, and so I think the left needs to be really clear that we need to come in. This needs to be overhauled, and that's because our current system isn't neutral, and so this is really just rebalancing the current system that we have. And yes, we need to move quickly, partly because climate change and inequality means if we don't move quickly, our society is going to hurtle towards lonely, exploitative, extractive norms very quickly. Doesn't mean we can't think to some degree about the public in this. And one thing that I would say is I actually think a lot of those progressive ideas are popular. If you look at polling on public ownership or opposing privatization, actually most of the public, when they're asked, don't support privatization and support rights at work and support free public services, universal services. So I actually think we can do all of that, or the progressive political parties can do all of that and still be popular. And I think it is important we don't just impose a different model that doesn't have public support. But I think some of it can be done quickly and by being clear about our priorities.
Good points. The world's kind of changing fairly rapidly right now. That's kind of the sense that people have. Do you think we need to be more self-reliant now in our thinking and strategy, given the way the world appears to be moving at the moment?
Yeah, I thought that was that's a really interesting question. When you mentioned you wanted to raise self-reliance, I guess there's different ways to take that. I don't think we need to be more self-reliant in the sense of, and I don't think you were necessarily meaning this, but just to clarify, I don't think we should all kind of retreat into our own homes and just focus on ourselves and our families. And I actually think some people on the right kind of want to tell that story, like just, in this time of crisis, just think about yourselves. So I think we don't have to be more self-reliant in that sense, but we do potentially need to be self-reliant in another sense, and maybe this is what you were getting at. I think we need to be more self-reliant in the sense of being willing as a community and as a state to invest in our own industries and build up our economy. Because I think the kind of hands-off approach to economic development has not served us well. It's increased our climate emissions, it's run down workers' rights, and it's essentially meant we are an economy focused on housing, a little bit of tourism, and with this historical commitment to agriculture. And we see lots of other countries moving towards what's sometimes described as onshoring or industrial policy. And I think the state does need to be active in supporting economic development. And so in that sense, I think we do need to be collectively self-reliant. Hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it's good. Before the 2023 election and following COVID, we just started to see some widening of what we call universal services. See, there was more free transport. There was some more free dental, but the state still had quite a long way to go. You've talked about expanding the scope and eligibility to these universal services, removing the costs. And while we see the current government, that's taking us back to more sort of like everyone pays, the user pays model. What is the case for universal services, and why would we all be better off for it?
Yeah, great question. So if universal services sounds a bit fuzzy to you, I think about things like free primary and secondary education. That's a universal service in the sense that it's a free public service open to everyone. Or think about something like how our public healthcare system is meant to operate, which is your essential healthcare is free. If you need surgery, you're not held back at the door, made to sign a form. It's free. And by the way, I've had my life saved twice by an amazing public healthcare system. You could also think of super, universal super. That's something that goes to everyone. And regardless of income, it's an entitlement of being in this country. Or another, I think, good local example is think about your public library, your local public library. That is a free service to anyone. And isn't it an amazing thing? You go in and we share books within the community. That is something where you're not stopped at the door based on your income. It goes to everyone. So yeah, the idea of universal services are these like free public services. And by the way, that can operate alongside Te Tiriti o Waitangi and targeted supports for Māori and Pacifica, for example. Now, the reason it's so important is essentially, first of all, I think it can raise our expectations of what is a good life. And I think we made big leaps when we moved towards free education and free healthcare. And I think our lives were just better. Secondly, in a more material sense, but connected to that, it made our lives less financially precarious because not having to pay for these essential services, they're being provided for free. So it cuts our bills as well as making our lives better. And another reason why this universal part of this is so important is that when you give a service, or when a government provides a service for free to everyone, what that does is it gets middle class buy-in from people. So everyone benefits. And when you get that middle class buy-in, the middle class is more likely to defend it. And we see that in our education and our healthcare services. So that they have stayed intact over time, whereas welfare and legal aid, which are only available to those with low incomes, they've been easier to toss aside because governments have been able to essentially throw poor people on the scrap heap. So there's a political advantage there too. And I think it's really important we talk about these universal services, and as you say, think about how we expand them to things like free dental or free public transport.
It's interesting. The earlier conversation you mentioned climate change, and another initiative that I've heard you talk about before is green infrastructure, like a ministry of green works. Could you please tell us a bit more about what that might look like and what the benefits would be?
Yeah, for sure. So some people will know we used to have a Ministry of Works, and people, will have different memories of that Ministry of Works. But in my experience interviewing people for some of this thinking around a Ministry of Green Works, a lot of people had quite positive memories of working for the Ministry of Works. It wasn't perfect, and in particular, it was a tool of colonisation at times. But a Ministry of Green Works would essentially be about learning from that experience and thinking about how the government itself can get back into building things. Because my analysis, and this was based on research I did with Jackie Paul and interviews with about 25 people, our analysis is that at the moment, the model we have of building things in this country is a bit broken. And one part of why it's broken is this contracting out model where you have subcontractors and chains of contracts isn't any good for accountability and holding people to projects, and it isn't any good for cost and actually keeping a lid on things. And the profit motive also means, and has meant, that that a lot of construction has undermined workers' rights and has also led to high carbon emissions. So what we propose in this report, which was funded by First Union and which you can find online, is that the government should get back into the business of building things again. And it can bring in expertise to do that. It can bring in people from the private sector to lead up operations. And the two areas that we focused on in that report were public housing and rail, and bringing back interregional passenger rail. And what we found out there, talking to experts, is New Zealand actually has quite a big network, and it just has to be reactivated, really. And it's partly a question of political will. With public housing, as people like Vanessa Cole have pointed out, we really need to scale up public housing, and that could help bring housing costs down, rents down. And one way to be able to scale it up is to make the most of low borrowing costs that government has and economies of scale. And we also talked about a tino rangatiratanga sphere, going back to Matike Mai, and funding infrastructure and housing for Māori entities in the iwi and hapu. And we have had some interest in this idea, and there has been some progress in government. But yeah, that was the gist of the idea.
Fantastic. New Zealand has some very high incarceration rates, and you've looked into this whole prison population situation, the inhumanity of prisons, and in particular, you mentioned better ways that prisoners could rebuild their lives. What's the evidence that there are far better ways to rehabilitate people than the path that we're actually seeing right now as we build more prisons and go down the, get tough on crime and throw away the key type path under this government? Yeah,
there's good evidence of that, that there are alternatives. And I drew this, not just from kind of desk research, but also from myself. Spending time in prisons. So over 3 years while I was living in the UK, I taught on a really amazing program called Learning Together, which brought together students from universities, Cambridge and Oxford, and students in prison. And there were these really awesome conversations where often the students in prison had a lot to teach those students from universities, from those very privileged universities. But what you saw there was, what you hear about is the patterns of why people ended up in prison, patterns of substance abuse, backgrounds of sexual abuse in some cases, mental health problems, head injuries, early bereavements. But to come to your question, the evidence is there in our own prison system that rehabilitation is not functioning well in prison, and also in reoffending rates. We know that at the moment we're just keeping people in prison for long periods and not really making society much safer. And recently, a judge, Ronald Young, said this on Q&A. The Chief Ombudsman, Judge Bosher, said a version of this, that we really need to rethink our prison system. And these are people who know what they're talking about. They've spent decades dealing with people and seeing people come out of prison again. So to get to alternatives, I mean, there are lots of things that can be done. As part of research into my book, The New Zealand Project, I went to Norway and looked at a different model that's done there. I mean, they still have prisons. They do have a much greater focus on education. There's good evidence, I think, and experience around problem-solving courts, which we have some of in New Zealand. So drug courts, the Te Ao Marama courts, and those are about actually focusing on what treatment people can get rather than sending people to prison. There's also evidence that community-based interventions, investment in mental health, investment in programs that stop people committing sexual misconduct before that happens, that those are all better ways to reduce social harm. And we have a massive amount of people in prison in New Zealand on remand. So that means people are not actually convicted of an offence. It's upwards of 40%, almost half of our prison population when I last looked. So people who haven't actually even been convicted of an offence. And one problematic thing is that people can't get rehabilitation in many cases when they're on remand. We really need to keep pressing on this. And it doesn't mean we can't have some accountability, we can't have some boundaries, but it means we respond to social harm in a way that actually makes us all safer.
Wow, thanks for that. The earlier conversation, we were just talking about Treaty Principles Bill and some related property, bringing up property rights. To most of us, the Regulatory Standards Bill is an attempt by staff to smuggle some libertarian values into the law and the way that the law views regulations. And, the core body, of it all there kind of looks like, I think Jane Kelsey called it old wine in new bottles. It's an old idea that's been around for a while in the New Zealand initiative, and it's the fourth time I think that ACT has tried to bring it into law. This is way more than just a simple transparency measure. It's more like a chilling effect on government who might try to impair, property rights for a whole lot of reasons. And private property is not even defined yet. So could you elaborate more on the way that this bill has progressed so far and your concerns about it?
Yeah, for sure. So might sound quite dry to some people, the Regulatory Standards Bill. I know you've done work kind of breaking it down. This is about regulation, and regulation is really about the rules that often keep us safe. So the rules that mean when we buy some food, we know that food meets some minimum quality standards. It means when we drive on the roads, we're in public transport, we know that there are some rules that mean that in general, we're going to drive together safely. It's the same rules that are meant to keep our buildings from leaking. And we know that when we deregulated in the early 90s, and we had the leaky buildings crisis, the leaky homes crisis. So what this is it's about chipping away, and sometimes doing more than just chipping away, but at those rules that keep us safe, that uphold public safety. So there was this consultation process, just to go back to where we're at now, around the Regulatory Standards Bill over Christmas. And people like Melanie Nelson, Tanya Waikato, Jane Kelsey, Jonathan Boston did a really good job of trying to make people aware of this. And I think there were 13,000 submissions on the Regulatory Standards Bill. And as you said, what it was doing was basically tying the hands of government and saying the government really needs to pause whenever it's bringing in a new regulation. And what that's doing is it's chilling the government from trying to make laws and rules that keep us safe, and then kind of handcuffing the government from trying to protect the public. And the reason it's doing that is because regulation is seen as a threat by, in particular, big business. So this is about big business, make no mistake, and boosting corporate power. Where it's at now, I believe, is in the next quarter. I think the Regulatory Standards Bill is going to be introduced. I think we recently learned that. And it's in the coalition agreement that it's going to be passed into law. So as you said, I think the fourth time. So, the same party that's introduced the 3 strikes legislation wasn't deterred by, the regulatory standards bill being struck out 3 times. And they're trying to push this through, even though it's been the subject of real public pushback.
Yeah, well, pushback and political change and movements and, what the public wants here. When it comes to organising and movements outside the political parties, what do you see as the critical issues of importance for the left to invest in now?
Yeah, so, and just to define who we're talking about here, I see like anyone as being on the left or progressive as people that believe in, an active state, for example, in supporting education and health, believe in te tiriti or waitangi, who believe in holding together communities. Those are some of the core values. I think it's a really great question, like what should we be thinking about outside of Parliament to build up those progressive ideas? Because the right, over the last 30, 40 years, through this network of think tanks, through these laws, through putting people into positions of power, have really tilted the playing field. I think there's a few quite specific things that would be really amazing interventions from the left. And if anyone has money to fund these things or is interested, I'd love to hear from you. But first of all, I think we could really use more progressive economic hubs. So, for example, an progressive economic think tank that can be a counterweight to the New Zealand initiative, which is really a quite right-wing libertarian economic think tank. So this would be a think tank that can popularize ideas like public ownership, explain, how do we bring public ownership to early childhood ECE or to dental or expand public transport. It could be, producing work on how do we restore rights at work, or how do we invest in the economy through something like a national development bank. So that's point number one. And as part of that, we could have more economics education, because I think that's really important. We're not scared of economics, and we can sometimes, there are economists that try to bamboozle us, and I think we need to be confident to push back. So we need more of that economics education. Secondly, I do think we need more progressive policy centres more generally, so that we can build up that vision, but also that level of detail that means we can roll out quite quickly a progressive agenda, as we were talking about earlier. I think we need more support for public interest litigation, so public interest law, so using the law to kind of defend what we're entitled to, and to make sure government doesn't abuse its power, but also to push forward the kind of frontiers of protection of our rights. And I think those are the key things that we need. There's probably lots of other interventions too, but I think an economics think tank, or maybe the final thing I'll say, so economics think tank number 1, progressive policy number 2, public interest law number 3, and then I think more left media. And I think you and others have been doing really good work, and I saw recently, the gathering of some people trying to work in the left media. But I think funding for publication, a left publication, a little bit like Tribune or Jacobin in the UK and the US, on top of the good podcasting work that's been done, can really help to continue to mainstream ideas. And you've been doing sterling work on that front.
Great. So last question: what is your vision for the future political order in Aotearoa New Zealand, if we can shake off everything that's holding us back?
Well, I think we can, and I want people to leave this not feeling bleak. I want people to feel a sense of hope, and there's so many organisations, communities fighting back right now and getting stronger as a result. My vision, maybe I'll start high level and then I'll go to a bit of detail, is we live in a society where we're not lonely. The loneliest group in our society are young people, and we know that from stats. I think it's 15 to 24-year-olds. It's not elderly people, that's Stats NZ. That shouldn't be the case. We should feel in a sense of community, and young people coming through should feel like they've got support wrapped around them. So it's a society that's not lonely. It's a society that's connected, where our local communities feel like places of home, where we know each other, where we have rich, expansive, beautiful public services. We have beautiful public housing, as we have done in the past. This doesn't have to be just a pipe dream, where we have public healthcare that saves our lives, but also doesn't choose to kind of leave out our teeth or our eyes, which is kind of how our public healthcare system works at the moment. Expansive public education, at primary school and high school, but also in early childhood and all through life. I could go on, but I think these things are achievable, and where we honour Te Tiriti o Waitangi, where we all know about our history, where we're proud of our history, where Māori have tino rangatiratanga, where we all support tino rangatiratanga and stand up for it, but we also have a relational sphere, where we look back and we go, remember that Matike Mai report? Lots of people didn't really know about it at the time, but it became a set of building blocks for the society we all live in now. So yeah, that's the kind of vision that I have, and I really do believe that that's within our grasp. And it's a vision where we protect our environment as well, where we arrest climate change, we play our part, we have international solidarities. I really believe that that's not a distant dream, but we have to connect up with each other to make that happen. We have to support groups doing good work and individuals doing good work, like Action Station, like yourself, like others. And we have to keep fighting back at all of these attempts to change irreversibly what we have. I want people to feel hopeful, and I think if we look after each other and we support each other, that future is possible.
That's fantastic. Hey, I just want to thank you, Max, for sharing all of your thoughts and knowledge tonight with the G News audience. It's been really interesting and very valuable for us all. And hopefully one day you can come back again and we'll do it all again on other topics, because there's plenty going on in this movement, I guess, that's starting to grow. Thank you very much. And that's all for now, but that's great. Have a good one.
Thanks so much, Jared, and thanks so much for all your work, and thanks to everyone who's listening and fighting the good fight. Maria.
Welcome to G News, the good news.
Yeah,